You're listening to Seminary Dropout, Episode 8. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 8. I'm so glad that you decided to join me as always. Today we've got an interview with missiologist and author, blogger, JR Woodward, and I'm really excited about this interview. This was one of the first ones I did and didn't have any credentials like I have a lot now. But basically, I emailed JR and said, hey, I'm starting this little podcast and want to know if you'd be able to do an interview with me. And he was kind and obliged and had a great time with him. And it's been a while since I did the interview, and listening over it, I was just really reminded how great the interview was. And so I hope you enjoy that. But let's get to it. I want to talk a little bit. I was going to talk about the blog post that I posted last Monday. Talked a little bit about the 40th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, which is 2 weeks ago, and about the state of abortion in this country and having pro-life as a greater life ethic as opposed to just meaning one specific thing. And so I hope you do go check that out. But I decided that instead of talking about that, I'd rather talk about the Super Bowl and Ray Lewis. It is currently 1:05 a.m. on February 4th. And so the Super Bowl was just over a matter of hours ago. And if you follow me on Twitter, you probably noticed that I was a little disturbed by some of the things that Ray Lewis said, and especially at the end of the Super Bowl. And then I caught some things that I hadn't known before about some things he said before the Super Bowl today, and some interviews and things like that. It all started at the end of the Super Bowl when they were obviously celebrating, and Ray Lewis quoted Romans 8:31, and he said, if God is for us, who can be against us? Obviously referring to his Super Bowl win. And I've got a huge problem with that, because that's not what that scripture is about. And that is, that's part of that mentality, is part of this larger health and wealth gospel, it's been called. It's just a fake gospel, a watered down version of the gospel. And I'm really just disturbed by this. And honestly, I mean, Ray, that doesn't even make a lot of sense. So if God is for you, that means he was against everyone on the 49ers team. And honestly, Ray, what's so special about you that God finds favor with you and not with anyone else? I was further disturbed by reading an article about something in the pregame show, and someone interviewed Ray and had asked him about the double homicide that he was involved in, I guess in the year 2000. And I honestly, I don't know a whole lot about that. I vaguely remember it. Don't have any real opinions about his role in that. But when asked about it, and let me just pull up the exact article so I can read exactly what he said. He said to the family, he's talking about the families families of the victims, the two homicides. So to the family, if you really knew the way God works, he don't use people who commits anything like that for his glory. No way. It's the total opposite. And so Ray is basically saying that his success in football, making it to the Super Bowl, is proof that he didn't commit these crimes, because if he had, God would not allow him success in football, allow him to get to the Super Bowl. There's so many problems with that. Ray, listen, I guess all I could really say is read your Bible. Moses killed an Egyptian, fairly large figure in the Bible. David, responsible for killing, Uriah the Hittite. He sent him out in the battle knowing that he would be killed to cover his tracks. Tracks being committing adultery with Uriah's wife. So there's those two among others. Paul being complicit in the deaths of many Christians. Paul going on to, write 2/3 of the New Testament. So this idea that God would not find favor with you or would not bless you because of something in your past, it's what it means is that you think that you are good enough for God to bless you, that you do deserve it, and that's just not the God of the Bible and of the gospel. The thing is that what I have in common with murderers, with rapists, what you, Ray Lewis, have in common with murderers and rapists is that we've all broken the barrier of sin, that we all have fallen short, and God's grace is more powerful than that sin. And as for good things happening to you and saying, if God is for us, who can be against us? Ray, look at the history of Christianity. You don't even have to look outside the Bible. And most of Jesus' followers, most of Jesus' disciples became martyrs. The legend is that Peter died upside down on a cross. Most of them met violent deaths. Think of Stephen being stoned. And look throughout history, those who really loved Jesus suffered for the sake of the gospel. They did not get rich. They did not have comfortable lives. In fact, their lives were decidedly uncomfortable precisely because they followed Jesus. What I find most sad about all of this is that I don't think that Ray pulled this from the air. I think someone's teaching him this, and I don't know anything about where Ray goes to church. So I'm not singling out any person, but the fact is that almost in any city in this country, he could find a church that would teach him this, that would teach him that if he followed Jesus, that he would have untold blessings, that God would do this for him. And so for the pastors out there, let's be better. Let's teach the real gospel, the gospel of Christ. And that, there are blessings, but they probably look a lot more like Paul, sitting in prison, having been shipwrecked, having been beaten, and saying, I consider it pure joy, my brothers, when faced with various trials and tribulations. He didn't say, I consider it joy because I've avoided various trials and tribulations, but that there was joy in those because God, that the sweetness of God was better than those things. Those are the blessings that come from God. Not the comforts that we have, not those things. That is not a product of following God. Read Job. Why do the wicked prosper? So, Ray, I want the best for you. I honestly believe that at some point you've had some kind of encounter with Jesus. I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. I don't know Ray Lewis. I don't know him personally. But I'm not in the habit of judging people's salvation, and so I can only take him at his word. And so I believe that he probably had some kind of encounter with the living Jesus, but it got so twisted at some point. It got so turned around. So let's do better. I want to move on. Thank you all who have given me feedback in the last few weeks that have left ratings on iTunes and comments, who've commented on the blog. I want to make one real quick announcement, and that's that I'm super, super excited about an interview that I just had confirmed. And I want to start doing this. I want to have interviews confirmed in advance to tell you who they are, because I really would like your input. And when you have questions for these people, I want to know, and I would love to pass along your questions to the people I talk to. I'm super excited about this. Many of you saw it on my Twitter and on the blog, but that I have gotten an interview confirmed with Richard Foster. That is a huge deal. He's a huge hero of mine. Celebration of Discipline was probably the most formative book outside the Bible in my spiritual life. So if you haven't read that, go read it in preparation for this interview, for listening to this interview. Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster. He also wrote one called Prayer, and he's written others that are just amazing. So I posted a quick blog post, announcing this. Hey, I'm going to interview Richard Foster. If you have questions, let me know. So if you have questions, go to that blog post and leave a question for him in the comment section, and I'll most likely ask it. If I get a lot that are similar, I'll try to kind of combine them and ask a general question in that vein. But go there and do that, or you can email me if you want, or even leave a voice message. There's a tab on my website where you can do that. So, yeah. All right. Well, without further ado, let's go to this JR Woodward interview. Thank you so much, JR, for doing this. And he has, in the last year, published a great book, and I hope you go check that out. And we'll obviously have all that stuff in the show notes for you to check out on seminarydropout.com. All right. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the interview. Well, with me today, I have my guest, JR Woodward. He's an equipper, activist, and author. And I'm glad to have him with me here today. JR, thanks for showing up.
It's good to be here, man. Good to be here.
Well, you have just come out with a book. It's about the missional culture, missional church. I've read several books on, or just writings in general on missional church and things like that. But I think you really had some ideas in the book that jumped out to me as unique and different and refreshing. And so I guess my first question that I want to ask you was, when I grew up in church, and we threw around some different phrases, being missions minded and things like that. And then I went to college and I started hearing this term missional. It's probably one of those things, kind of like the internet was around for years and years before we started using it and knew what it was. I have a feeling missional is probably that way, and the missional church. Can you tell us a little bit about missional church history and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I remember just for our congregation, I was trying to develop a little. I have a huge blog thing I did a couple years ago, but trying to get the history of it. And I think so. A lot of times people will say missional church. Isn't that kind of just saying something twice? And in one sense, yeah, but in the other sense, in a real quick way, really since the beginning of Protestantism, there's really been a schism between missiology and ecclesiology, or missiology, the study of missions, and ecclesiology, the study of the church. So, but church and mission were different because whether it was in Europe where the states started the church, it was just assumed that mission was something you did elsewhere, not in your own backyard. Now, it came over to America, and there was still, a separation between these things in different ways. Obviously, it's not like the state started the church, but there was still this divide between mission is something you do elsewhere. So we had mission societies to go reach other countries, and but we're kind of the church here. And so I think what started to happen, in my understanding of the history, is, when Barth was kind of wrote his church dogmatics, he really kind of brought the Trinity back to conversation. Up to that point, it was like something you confess, but not something you really wrote about in the Age of Reason. And so, and someone listening to that lecture kind of brought back the whole Missio Dei, which to me is central to when we say missional church, and that is that God himself is a missionary in his own being, and then we as a people are a sent people. So there's, at central of the missional church is like understanding that God in his nature is missionary. And so the mission involves the church, but it's driven, if you will, by God. Yeah. I think then the gospel, really you had the liberals started talking about Jesus' words and what is the kingdom about. And pretty early on, the whole kingdom idea was brought up. And I think the gospel then, as it moved into like the historical Jesus, like the third, what's the term I'm looking for here?
Yeah.
Like N.T. Wright being, a part of
the search for,
the historical Jesus. So there's like three different levels. We're kind of in the third stream of it. And which is kind of, it's finally kind of got more to the conservative side. But I think the gospel, then, that's the big topic today, right? What is the gospel? Mm-hmm. But I feel like it made a more robust gospel. Mm-hmm. So a missionary God, a robust gospel, being a sent people. And then I think even looking at scriptures with a missional hermeneutic. Mm-hmm. David Bosch, was a big part of helping that. Leslie Newbegin was one who was really bringing all of these ideas together in a lot of his writing. Not only him, but, and so by the time like 1996 or 98, when Guter and a team of 6 people wrote the missional church as it relates to North America, I think that's where the terminology we started using, but a lot of people without any background of what this is. Oh, it's like, helping out at the school and that's missional. Well, maybe not, because it's missional is more about who God is and who we are. Yeah. And then obviously that flows out.
Yeah. Yeah. You, reminded me of a story, and I can't remember where I heard this. It's from an author, but he talked about, growing up in the church, sitting in church one day as a little boy, and he was listening to, a visiting missionary that was coming in, that was on furlough. Yeah. And, talking about the work that they do. And he looks outside and he sees some other kids playing on the playground. And he thought, if we could only get these kids on a plane and send them to a foreign country, this missionary could tell them about the gospel, about Christ. That's so that idea, that missional idea that it is here. Yeah. It is now. And it's also not just a professional missionary's job.
That's right.
As well.
That's right. Yeah, we're all sent.
Yeah. So the book is about building in a missional culture, in our churches. So how do we go about doing that? Yeah.
Well, I maybe first want to say that, like, a lot of times when it comes to, asking the question, why don't we have more mature disciples? I think one of the things that we forget is the power of culture. And so that power, like, that we create a culture in the congregation and that reshapes us in the process. And so, but when we look at culture, I mean, I try to look at different elements of culture, like what makes up culture. So that's one way to look at it. I try to look at it from what type of environments are we cultivating. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to the elements, like, I guess simply I kind of put them on a Celtic cross with a little dove coming down, and partly because I want to remind ourselves that the church isn't just kind of a social organization. It has divine roots. It's human and holy. Mm-hmm. And with that understanding, the Celtic cross has like a circle in the middle and a circle on the edges. Right. Yeah. And so in the middle you have like language and artifacts. Language, Newbegin would say is very central, because within words create worlds, and so they're very powerful. We don't, life and death are in the power of the tongue. Yeah.
So what's an example of that, maybe in a community that you've been a part of, where what part did language take place?
Well, okay, like, I think we can hear, like, sometimes just listening to how people articulate things helps us know, do we understand, is it kind of creating a missional culture? So, for example, it's very common, and this is kind of maybe a silly example, but like, we talk about going to church. Mm-hmm. So when you hear, like, I'm going to go to church, like, what do you think of? What does that make you think of?
Going to a building where we have this thing that we call church, this gathering.
Right. Instead of, like, for me, like going to a gathering or going to a worship service, when we say going to the church, then we automatically presume that church is something that happens in a limited time and in a limited space. Right. Instead of us being the church. and we just going to a gathering because we self-identify as the church wherever we happen to be. So like, no, it might seem like a little thing, like
no.
language,
I think that's very telling. Yeah.
Yeah.
We know, and the funny thing is like, intellectually, obviously I know that's wrong, but I will,
yeah,
I'll keep saying we're going to church, and I think it's funny because my faith community now, my church now, refers to it as liturgy. We're going to liturgy.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm unlearning those things.
Right. And so, I mean, one just kind of conceives of church, and I think then we feel more comfortable, like we're not in church now that we're not at church, like
right.
We're not the church.
Right.
That's the kind of underlying kind of unconscious assumption probably.
Sure.
So yeah, it's language like that. So, when you start to have different language, then we realize, we're sent people. Anything that can help us know that our very identity is that we're sent. So we have to ask the question, who has God sent us to? And what are we doing in that space? Like, are we being faithful to be who we need to be in that space? And, so you have language, you have artifacts.
Right.
I think those are kind of central to culture, but then narrative kind of gives meaning to the words and the artifacts.
Okay.
So that kind of is the
top part of the cross.
Top part of the cross. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And I kind of have on the left part rituals, and then on the down institution. And we have a lot of people that are anti-institution.
Right.
But I try to make a distinction between institution and institutionalism, because if you look at institution, I like the way Volve, using Peter Berger and another dude, the way he defines institution is like two or more people doing the same thing over a period of time. You have institution, you have politics, you have everything. So you have to start to think about those things. And I would say too, the other reason why I like the word institution is because if we believe in the redemption of all things, then do we believe in the redemption of institutions? And institutions have a powerful effect. They add more of a stability element to things. So they don't have to be against movement.
Right.
They can actually, but then you have institutionalism, which is a bad variance of that. So the institution on the bottom, and then on the other side we have ethics. And then, so when you have those six, to me, like six things, like language, artifacts, narrative, rituals, institution, and ethics is a fairly easy to remember. But then you can build off of that. So narrative, you have theology, stories, and doctrines. And when it comes to rituals, you have rites, practices, and liturgy. And then when you have institution, you have symbols, strategies, and structures. And then when you have ethics, being, doing, and reflecting. And so that might feel like a lot, but I think when we understand those six core elements and the other three that kind of flow from that, you have, in a sense, trying to take apart and put together in a nice way, what is culture, and then you can start examining, what is the primary narrative that we live under, really, as a community, and is it something that helps us realize who we are, that God has blessed us so that we can be a blessing to the world, not that just God has blessed us, and to hell with the rest, No, he's like, there's the whole purpose of the blessing is so that we could be a blessing to others. Or what's the narrative when it comes to violence and peacemaking? Where's the storyline drive us? Where does Jesus' life drive us? And I think when we live in that narrative, eventually there's, when it comes to doctrines, like some people don't like to talk about doctrines, but everybody has doctrines. Every worldview has doctrines. It's just the things that you start to become more convinced about and are continually part of the storyline of whatever social entity that you're part of, including the church.
So I want to ask about, because a lot of the terms that you threw out are we might be familiar with, but when you say artifacts, what's an example of artifacts?
Okay, yeah. So artifact is anything that we create. I kind of use artifacts in the way Andy Crouch in Culture Makers does. Is like we were created to be culture makers, and we create an artifact. Could be a book, like the book I wrote. It could be a pancake, could be an omelet, could be a building, could be a song. So it's just anything that we create, then that starts to influence or shapes people in different ways. It's a concrete thing. And so the Bible is an artifact. It's a human and holy artifact. When we take the bread and the wine, those are artifacts.
Sure.
So does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Hopefully clarifies.
So, for instance, like my community here, Mosaic in Austin, we have, quarterly meals together. And so that's kind of, that kind of shapes who we are. And it says a little bit about what we value. Where, instead for that Sunday 1 month, instead of the regular, song sermon, we just all come and people bring food and we sit on the ground and we eat together. And so, so would that be an example of an artifact? Yeah, definitely. I mean, the people who created the food and how it was created and what it was created for. And then, like Crouch kind of talks about how, artifacts have different levels of influence. So, omelet maybe have a small influence for a small amount of people. A song, it could reach, only a family, or it could kind of reach a country and shape a whole people. So an artifact has different levels of influence, I guess.
You talk about, in the book, 5 different equippers.
Mm-hmm.
Real quick, what are those 5 equippers and what significance do they have in a missional culture?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So the 5 equippers are found in Ephesians 4. And I think one of the things that is unique about the book of Ephesians, it really is kind of this idea of calling is kind of a theme throughout. And it's even kind of living out the calling that God gave us before the foundations of the world. It's kind of discovering who we are. And so the typologies that we find in Ephesians 4, the apostle, the prophet, the evangelist, and the pastor and the teacher. Mm-hmm. What's fascinating about those giftings is they're not actually gifts that people have, but the people themselves are the gifts. So it says Christ has given the church the apostles, the prophets. So it's a people gift.
Yeah.
Because it's tied into vocation and calling, it's kind of like, it's hard to separate calling out from who we are.
Right.
And as opposed to some of the other spaces where, the other gifts kind of come into play, in 1 Corinthians 12, you have manifestation gifts. That's the word used preceded all the different gifts. So you might have the gift of mercy and the gift of healing and use it in an evangelistic kind of way, or you could have those gifts and use it in a pastoral way that's maybe more inward to the congregation. So the calling, these are like 5 types of calling that I think actually both non-Christians and Christians have, but they become redemptive, and given to the body when we answer our call to Christ.
Yeah.
And then Christ gives the church these 5 types of people. So I would say there's a 3-dimensional reading of Ephesians 4. One is just the calling that I think all people have, and he even 4:1 kind of indicates everybody has one of these calls. 2, we tend to do ministry through these different streams or avenue, so it can be using my gifts to live out more an evangelistic call or pastoral call or prophetic call. And then 3, that I think you can, as we live out these callings, like some people are going to have the capacity to coach or equip the rest of the body to live out these callings as well. Because if you look at it, we're all to be teachers and teach one another. We're all to be pastors and care for each other. We're all to be evangelists and be witnesses, to the spaces that God brings us. We're all to be, challenge and be kind of prophetic, and we're all to be apostolic in the sense of going out as sent ones. So, but there's some people who are going to get to the point where they're more coaching other people, and it's more of an equipping gift. So I don't think everybody has that calling to do that.
Right.
But some have that calling. And so these equippers, what I look at is they're creating and cultivating, each of them are kind of cultivating a type of environment. So the teacher is kind of creating a learning environment, the pastor a more healing environment, the evangelist a welcoming environment, the prophet a liberating environment, and the apostle more of a thriving environment, kind of multiplication and things like that.
And so with that in mind, talk a little bit about a polycentric leadership structure, which is something that you talk about in the book.
Yeah. So, leaders, Spirit-led leaders, we create culture. but also like our approach to leadership powerfully creates a culture. And so, in the book, like I kind of make a case for what I call polycentric leadership, which is opposed to both hierarchical and flat. So hierarchy, I think we all probably know that.
Right.
I can explain it if I need to, but for those who might not have encountered that.
We're probably very familiar. Yeah.
And then, it's fun my PhD work is probably going to be on where did that structure come from in the current American church. That would be one of the questions. But two, it's also not, polycentric is not flat leadership. I think flat is kind of maybe this ideal that, somehow we don't have leadership or people aren't going to emerge as leaders. So polycentric is maybe thinking some illustrations is like a jazz band where, each person has their own instrument, and instead of just one instrument being the lead the whole time, the lead instrument revolves just when they get in the groove. They just about now keep in mind that means these are skilled and mature musicians. Right. So this isn't just something you walk into. Sure. Or take the geese, the famous, geese that kind of fly in a V, and when they have to travel long distance, the lead geese kind of breaks the wind for the others, and but then there's a rotation. It's not the one geese the whole time, and it's not 5 geese flying all together, and not benefiting from the other leading for a season. So, and then maybe since we're here in Austin, the bikers and the drafting, and if you're on the same team, you're probably going to rotate so that each can benefit a bit from the other. And I think that's, when that type of approach to leadership is in the church, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, because I think if fundamentally we're called, our first sense of identity is followers of Jesus. And I think the sad thing is if you start to be put into a hierarchical role, I think we don't realize how that shapes us. So now, in a hierarchy, I would be the leader all the time, every space, and I never, for all intents and purposes, at least in a lot of different ways that we do church, never have to be a concrete follower to another human being again, because I've reached the top. And the problem is, I think we have enough concrete evidence that structure actually, can take a good person and make him not as good.
Yeah. I think we've probably all seen examples of that happening. I guess, my question to follow up with that is, there's probably there's going to be a lot of, pastors, youth ministers, other people on staff at church that are listening to this and are going to say, but on the practical side of that, how do you function without clear leadership? I mean, usually, hopefully all staff in a church agree on dogma, but, usually there's some secondary issues that maybe people disagree on and stuff like that. And so, you maybe have to decide what's going to be a church's stance, or what is going to be taught at the church, or decisions have to be made. So when there's not clear leadership, or rather hierarchical leadership, who makes that call, and how do we all get along, and how does that work practically?
Well, let me just ask you a question, and then I'd like to respond to that. But how does that typically happen in a hierarchical situation, would you say? Pick an issue.
Yeah. So usually it would be, hey, I'm senior pastor at X church, and here's what I've decided that we're going to do, and so fall in line. And
so make it more concrete for me just for a minute.
Like a real issue. So, I've decided that, I've decided that we are going to be a deacon-led church. And I know that there's some of you that think that we need to be elder-led, but I've decided this is how it's going to be.
Okay. So, obviously, let me say this. When it comes to hierarchical leadership, there's some that can kind of, we can picture it in the worst type of way it could be, which to me, that example would be that. It just about presumes that there's not a whole lot of conversation going on with the community and kind of arriving to a decision. I know this is a tense thing, but we're going to kind of go with this. Yeah. and I'm as I hear it. Sure. And then I think like I've also known like you can have very soft hierarchical leadership where someone realizes, you know what, like I really don't want to be in this particular role. I need a team. I want to work. And so I don't get to explain all that in the book. So I'd like to kind of say that because I do feel like there's some hierarchical elements that are a little bit more healthy than others. Right. But with that said, like, to get it practical, let's just say, I would say, would you agree that like the teaching on a gathering in a liturgical teaching on a weekly gathering, that role, who decides what's taught and who's teaching it, would you say that has a significant part of leadership to what is typically a senior pastor role?
Right. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So the way I would look at polycentric leadership is like if we're, again, I'm assuming like maturity based on like what an elder looks like as described in the, the character and the skills of an elder in the scripture. It's sort of like, we're the jazz band. So, let's say we have this group of people who are gifted in different ways. Let's say you're a teacher and prophet, I'm apostle, evangelist, and someone else is a pastor. And we're a part of this team and we want to lead in a polycentric way. Let's just say there's 3 of us, but we express those 5 gifts. And we're looking at preaching. Well, in a typical hierarchical thing, I think the senior pastor pretty much decides what they're going to preach and how they're going to preach, and they work it out and often are the preacher too. In this case, I would say, let's go back and say you're the pastor. For me, we use like, again, just to make it concrete, let's say we're using the Christian calendar from Advent to Pentecost. Advent is to me a very pastoral series. So, it's about hope and love. And so I would put the pastor person, because their maturity, in charge of that series. They would be the hierarchy at that point. So there is hierarchy in polycentric leadership. It's just not the same person all the time in every space. So there is clarity in roles, and I think those are some of the things we need, as opposed to flat leadership. But and then maybe Epiphany is more for the apostle or the evangelist. Lent is more prophetic. And so it doesn't mean you preach all of those, but if you're in charge of Lent, the beautiful thing is, like, let's say that you're younger and less experienced, or maybe you're more experienced and older. But like, if you're doing that role, now I'm following you, and I can tell you because we're all for each other, and we really do have a basic sense of love and for each other, and mature and comfortable in our own skin. I can say, when you led, I really loved these things about how you did that. And then, but I also kind of, when you did this, I kind of felt this way, or, and I feel like discipleship then is continuing to happen. And one of the most, really, to me, if we believe we kind of get dysfunctional from our family, original sin, and if we believe that we become whole again through, community, if community is that important to reach wholeness, and if leadership is primarily example, and we're to imitate each other as we're following Christ, then I don't know how, without being in a community of leaders, that you can actually give what the congregation needs the most as an example of a community, people learning how to work out through issues. And there's leadership and there's followership and there's that pattern. So just like the bikers, it doesn't mean there's, greater value because you're the person in front for that time, or you switch in places. It's like, no, like there's purposefulness, there's communication, there is direction, but it's a working together to get to a place, I think, in a healthier way for everybody, and a good model for the congregation. Yeah,
and that makes a lot of sense. And it's funny, and maybe ashamed that churches tend to organize their staff into a music pastor or worship pastor, and there's a youth pastor, and then there's a senior pastor, a lead pastor, and larger churches have different variations on that. How different would it be if we organized it into the disciple pastor and the evangelistic pastor and apostle and so on?
Right. Yeah.
And what our churches might look like if we did that instead.
Yeah, because I mean, the beautiful thing about that whole Ephesians 4 passage is that Jesus is the archetypical apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, and teacher. So if we're called to be the body of Christ and be his hands and feet, under the power of the Spirit today, without an appreciation and understanding of those things, we will either miss part of the ministry that we're called to do, or we'll miss part of the character that we need to develop. Because Paul, he takes these 5 equippers that Christ has given as gifts to the church, and he ties that to the maturity of the church and the unity of the church. And I probably don't give enough time to that unity factor, but I feel like what often happens in a hierarchical role is like whoever is the lead person, senior pastor, whatever their particular gifts are of these 5 types of callings, that's what kind of is, I guess, celebrated typically in the congregation, And the problem is there's some of them that have naturally kind of have angst with each other, So an apostle, you kind of want to start a new thing, a new ministry, birth new churches, you just want to get out there and do all these things. And the pastor's like, we got a lot of, mess here. Like, I thought we have to care for the people a little bit more. And the teacher's like, well, we need to kind of, inhabit the story a little bit better. And so there's tension at the table, but it's because we all come with a different set of eyes, a different perspective, but that's what makes it a good thing, a holy thing and a whole thing.
As you're saying this, part of me is wondering, I wonder if why there's so much conflict in church between pastors and congregants is because we have a pastor who is an apostle and we want them to be a prophet or an evangelist or a disciple, obviously I think probably as believers we have a little bit of that in us, but we have a primary gifting there. We are that primary gift.
That's right.
And so we want our pastors to be all of that. We want their primary gift to be all of those things. And maybe God didn't create us that way.
I think you make a really great point. I think when we start to appreciate kind of, number one, that we each kind of have one of these callings to some degree or another, and we're either like a player or coach in the process, we're looking at the world and the scripture and everything with that viewpoint. Now, but let's say the senior pastor, we call them pastor often. Right. And so we already kind of expect certain things from a word, because a pastor is a shepherd, there's a caregiver, there's that loving element. And to be honest, if there's a lot of senior pastors that more apostolic, and maybe pastoral is actually their last sense of calling and gift, but because we have a perspective of a pastor, and maybe I'm let's say someone, is a gifted pastor, is like, you're doing a horrible job,
Right. Yeah.
And so, and now here's the beautiful thing, the learning that can happen is, number one, when we understand these 5 kind of callings and gifts, that, people gifts, that we can have a proper expectation of the roles that people have. Number 2, I have often found if I'm always agitated that our community isn't really kind of being witnesses in the way we need to, or proclaiming the good news by being witnesses, we're so inward, that might be a good hint that I'm an evangelist. Right. And guess what? If you're an evangelist, one of the roles of the evangelist is not just being an evangelist, but equipping the body to be the evangelist. So your whole point is how do you now kind of build that perspective into the whole? And now it becomes productive. So I think an appreciation of these 5 really does kind of help everybody, and you actually get along, and you start to, it's kind of like any self, understanding tool, whether it's like the Enneagram or Myers-Briggs or DISC. Sure. I think it gives us a way to view others, and not in a judgmental way, but that's kind of their strengths, and those are kind of their correlating weaknesses, and we can live with that,
Yeah. And that's so interesting, because I was kind of thinking of that too as you were talking. That is very similar to, all those strengths finder and stuff like that. They're on the secular level, but have very spiritual implications, I think. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that a lot of those people say that specialize in those kind of tests are that you should really focus on your strengths, and instead of, instead of trying to muster up those gifts that you don't have. Focus on making your strengths better. And what would be just think about the implications of that if instead of we made our pastor who is truly a prophet, instead of blaming him for not being a pastor, if we gave him the freedom to fully develop his gifts of prophecy, of being a prophet, like what that might look like. It's very interesting stuff.
Yeah, and I think and this is kind of also why I think we need more than just one person, because then we're going to bend the whole congregation a particular way instead of that polycentric leadership. But yeah, you're right. It kind of frees people to be who they are, and I'm always of the opinion, ideally, and it's not every stage of a church, but if most people can spend 80% of their time in the areas that they're passionate, gifted, called to do, 20% where it's needed, you got a healthy perspective. So we're all the kind of, obviously a gift isn't saying, I don't need to care for you because I'm not, I'm a prophet and I'm not a pastor, but you're right. We have to let people live into who they are. And and as we do that and help each other identify that, we'll go better because we're working as a body. And I think, whenever Paul uses that, he goes to that analogy quite a bit because, a tongue by itself isn't that helpful. It needs to be attached to a few other things. A finger not attached to the body is helpful when it's attached. And so there's an interdependency that we start to have when we operate this way too, because we appreciate what we don't have, who we are not, and we appreciate who someone is. And we realize, I have to do this together. And this goes back to that unity. In order to kind of really live as the body, we have to be united. We have to be attached. We can't just kind of be disassembled.
So would you be a proponent of, and of course I think, probably context matters a lot, but all things being equal, a church having on staff a disciple, an evangelist, apostle, prophet, and a pastor?
So we have apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher.
Teacher, yeah. I said disciple, teacher, yeah.
Yeah. All of them disciples, but
right. Hopefully.
Yeah. We're assuming all that. I would say this, the way that it's working out in LA is we have, it's never, I think the ideal to shoot for is to have, for us, let me back up a step. So for us, kind of the bread and butter, what we do is kind of multiply mid-sized groups. And as mid-sized groups kind of grow and multiply, you have a weekly gathering for those in that neighborhood. Okay. And I think by the time you have about even just 150 people, you could have 5 qualified people who lead. Now, for a church of 150, you're probably not going to resource all of those people.
Right.
And so what I would say is so the way we have it is there's really, when it comes to funding aspect of things, and I'm assuming staff means funding element, but let's,
it could or couldn't, but right. Usually we assume, yeah.
We just about assume that. So, but what we see is we have some people who are fully funded, some who are partially funded, and some that are not funded at all. Mm-hmm. And so I think thinking bivocationally, thinking that as long as we're thinking about staff, if you will, from not necessarily all funded, but I do think, yeah, in an ideal sense, you do have 5 people whose
have voices are being heard.
Yeah. And most people have a primary, secondary that comes strong, and that creates a subtype. But yeah, I think when you have 5, I think you could just about say that kind of starts to define a healthy congregation when they have those 5 types of leaders working together, bringing fully who they are to the table, and also kind of, bringing clarity what they do. Again, not 5 geese all flying the same, except for when it comes to kind of developing your cultural web. I think it's important to have as much input from as much of the congregation to set your basic DNA. But really when you have that basically set, and you have a structure that's more decentralized than centralized, there's centralized parts and there's decentralized parts and there's clarity in roles. I think the polycentric thing even is a bit easier to practice in that.
You talk about the 5 environments for the missional church. 5 seems to be a popular number in the book.
Originally my original title was 5.
5. That's really funny. The 5 kept coming up, and it's a good number. So you talk about the 5 environments for a missional church. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I talk about them in chapter 3, and I don't necessarily tie them to these 5 equippers, but they are tied to it. So, a learning environment is the one I think the teacher is concerned about. And I think when I think about learning, it's kind of, it goes beyond, looking at how well is the preaching. It goes to, if we have a learning environment, people are actually doing something different as a result of learning something. So learning isn't really happening until we've done something different. And learning is a good thing, a good sense that people are learning if they're teaching other people. In fact, you could say one of the better ways to learn is to teach as you do. Right. You're doing and you're teaching, but most of us know if we had to prepare a lesson, you're going to learn a little bit more than if you just come as a passive listener. So there's an active element to learning, and so I think that's what the teacher is concerned. How do we create an environment where people inhabit and live in the text, live in the story of God? And I think there's dialogue there. There's times for monologue and there's times for dialogue, but in the end, people haven't learned until we've done something different. The healing environment is kind of more where I look at the pastor, and that's kind of really helping people pursue a sense of healing and wholeness. So I think even today we were at a conference where someone was talking about vulnerability, the importance of that. I think hopefully we can develop a relationship with at least a couple of people, so we have that intimate space where we can really share both what is exciting, what good things are happening, as well as where we're coming short. And so to me, like, confession is kind of a concrete practice if we're going to have a healing environment. And we probably can learn a lot from even groups like AA, where it just seems like they got to a point where, the vulnerability that you see there, the reason, maybe the reason it happened is like they get to the point where they don't feel like they have to protect anything anymore. They've lost their reputation, everything's gone, and so you're not protecting the one sense of false self.
There's something very, very spiritual about what goes on at AA. Where the previous town my wife and I lived, we had a friend who's a recovering alcoholic, and he was crossing his 15-year mark or something like that, and so they're about to have a special meeting for him.
Oh, that's cool.
And we were invited to it, and just from the moment we walk in, and we were a little bit late, and there's just a room full of people, and just a guy who didn't even know us. He saw us come in, and I think he could tell we were outsiders by the look on our faces, and just kind of waved us in. And there was such a community in that room, and just hearing my friend's story and other people's stories about their recovery. There's a certain humility to it, and I think it's that confessional issue. I've seen it. This is maybe kind of weird, but to a much lesser degree. But I've seen it in my Toastmasters group.
Oh yeah.
There's something about if I have to get up in front of you and give a speech, and if I do that enough, I'm gonna say something really dumb. I'm gonna give a speech that isn't so good. But part of opening myself up to people is being vulnerable, and also seeing that when that happens, when I have given a speech, I think that was just terrible, and people don't hate me for it, and people love me anyways. And part of that is because they've done the same thing, and I reciprocated it.
Yeah,
there's something so spiritual about that vulnerability that way. I think you're right.
I that's a great, because in a lot of ways, like what you kind of explain, what does it need? What type of environment creates that vulnerability? And I think, say, Toastmasters is a great idea. Is like you're critiquing, but you're also like critiquing in a way that's everybody's for each other. Fundamentally, you created an environment like everybody here in the same situation, but they're for you, they're for your development, your growth. So you can hear the critique quite easily when it comes. So I think fundamentally, like, confession is really easy if you know that person is for you and that you're for that other person. So until you have that, you don't have confession. I mean, it's just a nice name, but it's like, it's not going to happen.
Right. Yeah. If I don't know someone's for me, you said it right. Confession's a nice thing, but I'm not going to open up. No, man, I'm going to lock that down so tight. You'll never know.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think that we've done that a lot in church.
Yeah.
So it speaks a lot to communities that do create a culture that's open to confession.
Yeah. So and then so I think that's part of the healing environment and moving toward wholeness. Again, like with the Toastmasters, like you actually, you become a better speaker because you hear critique because of the environment, and I think that's what a healing environment's about, and that's how we'll experience healing. And so the funny thing is, as you start to create that environment, as people start to be more open, at least even within smaller groups or whatever that's happening, you create that environment, and that environment then starts to recreate everybody in that space. You've seen that power in different spaces, and this is the power of culture. Toastmasters develops a culture, and that culture shapes every speaker. And this is really why the book is like, sometimes we think of spiritual formation so individualistically, but I can tell you what, the power of the culture on what we do as an individual is huge, and it has huge ramifications, and that's why we got to pay attention to it. The evangelist is kind of creating a welcoming culture. I talk about in the book, we had, I living in Hollywood, like we have a huge Scientology training center next door. We got all kinds of people coming from different directions, and I really try to encourage our congregation, and people I don't know, this one lady came to me, "Hi, my name's Latifah, I'm a Muslim." That's how she introduced herself. And, I said, "Great, it's great. Thank you for coming," and blah, 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 blah. Now, within a little bit of time, she tells me, it's like, "JR, it's like, I just want to thank you for this church here because, I've gone to a lot of churches, Christian churches in the area. And when I tell them I'm Muslim, all of a sudden, like, I feel like a wall goes up. And from that point on, I'm treated quite differently. And, I just want to say thank you for kind of creating an environment where, people can kind of accept me who I am." So I think now, someone, will ask me like, so the Scientologist who's attending and so forth, like, don't we need to challenge all of his beliefs and so forth? And so I don't know that that's the starting point. Obviously Paul says I became a Jew, a Greek to the Greek so that I win them. But like he found points of identification, not points of contrast.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's funny that in Acts, Paul, he identifies with them by, quoting back to them their own pagan poetry.
Yeah,
he finds those identifying points that are common even with the culture. And, I think sometimes in the past we've looked down on that as believers, that if we try to engage in popular culture, and I think the tides have definitely shifted there. That's more accepted now, especially in kind of circles that you and I run in.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a powerful thing.
Yeah, and the other thing I usually say is, as we as a community, if Jesus is our Lord and we are lifting him up, and he talks about he'll draw all people to himself. And so just for this story of Latifah, like she felt welcome. So guess what? She would come to our weekly gathering. Just so happens that I was doing like me and some others were doing an 8-part series on the life of Jesus. So we were taking him from the beginning till his death and resurrection. And literally everybody knew Latifah. She's just, she was kind of a life of the party. I think she has a very, Muslim means like follower of God. I think it's like, it's kind of it's a beautiful kind of sacred, meaning to that name. And so, the best she was doing, she was following everything. So as we continue to preach about Jesus, we kind of, the space in Hollywood is kind of like, there's a balcony, and she just happened to be right in the middle of the room. And, at the last, part of the series, 8 parts, and before, I started praying, she literally just kind of got up out of her seat, and she says, like, Jesus is Lord, Jesus is Lord, Jesus is Lord. And then she fell down and just tears coming down her face as she kind of, just went down to the floor and bowing down. And the whole congregation is just kind of watching this in awe. And to me, it was a picture of just help people understand who Jesus is. Don't try to critique who they are. Be welcoming, love people because they're human beings. Appreciate. I know a lot of Muslims in LA, and to be honest, they live a more holy life than many of the Christians that I know. Whether it's the way they engage in hospitality, whether it's, everything they eat, means something to them, and the devotion. To me, there's a lot we could learn from people of other faiths as we are still trying to follow Jesus ourselves.
How precious is that story when you think of the scriptures? If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, it gives you goosebumps to think, and that this person who
definitely,
who from the first time meets you says, I'm a Muslim. And then that happens. It's so powerful. And if you had not taken that stance, and when she said, "Hey, I'm a Muslim," and you had said, "Well, let me tell you why that's wrong,"
Oh yeah, or even if we didn't say it, if all of a sudden a wall came down, that
absolutely,
they fell, or anything like that.
Absolutely, yeah. If you had not been your full self with her after that, instead of just like you said, lifting him up and letting him draw people,
Yeah, and so I think the evangelists, that's their work, is to kind of create a welcoming environment, because, it's not everybody's natural disposition, I think the more mature one is, the more one can appreciate, where other people are at no matter what. Yeah. So usually I find this kind of defensiveness comes when we're not so comfortable in our own skin, But then the prophet, is there, and I think they're helping the community develop a liberating environment. So it's liberating from our sin, our personal sins, but it's also speaking truth to powers and liberating. Looking at our neighborhood and what needs to change, and speaking into the structure of the church or whatever. And then the apostles creating a thriving environment. So, I kind of use a symbol for each of them. So the apostles like a fire, because it kind of just spreads kind of quickly, and they're, as being sent ones, as there's a real desire to develop a discipleship ethos and helping, see disciples multiplied, and instead of, just adding people, we're really making disciples of Christ. And multiplication at some point starts to take off a lot quicker than addition.
I feel like we could talk all day, but I'm going to think better of that if I want anyone to listen to my podcast.
Sure.
But real quick, talk about, you helped found two organizations, the Missio Alliance and Ecclesia Network. Talk real quick about those.
Okay. And you can kind of pronounce Ecclesia or Ecclesia. We tend to use Ecclesia for this one.
Okay.
There's definitely, both are proper. So Ecclesia is something that we, Chris Backer and myself and maybe 5-6 other pastors started. It's probably been about 6 years ago. And the main thing with that is we're a network of missional leaders and churches, and one of the things that we do is really help people who want to plant churches. We have an annual time of training for them, and then able to connect them to peer mentoring, hold some regional events like we kind of held today, where you're even it's bigger, where you kind of hold events where maybe you're creating a learning environment between churches. So there's all kinds of things what Ecclesia is about. But I would say the focus is helping, missional leaders connect, helping plant churches. It's more in that realm. I didn't found this one, but the Fresh Expressions is another thing I participate in that my friend Chris Backert does. And that's really kind of geared to help mainline churches go more missional. It's a movement that comes from the UK, in the Church of England, and there's a number of denominations that are part of it. So there's something we do for the church planner that maybe doesn't have a network, or maybe their network isn't as robust as they want. They might be part of that. Fresh Expressions is a lot for the mainline go missional, and then the the new thing that about started conversation about a year and a half ago, and really kind of birthed from a conversation we had in the Ecclesia Network, and that was like in the broader stuff of what's happening in our world. Like there's a lot of polarities when it comes to a lot of new issues that we face in the current context of North America. And so we feel like overall I feel like there's a lot of pretty good, solid, practical things out there, like conferences that are really, really good for the practitioner. But I think there's I would say in general, like there's not the theological depth at some of that, and so we felt the need for both kind of a theological depth and as well as a practice orientation. And we felt like, so what would it look like if, we kind of brought a greater conversation between the seminaries where a lot of, the teachers are, the practitioners and the spiritual direction people, and brought that all together and tried to navigate, some of the issues that we face today, in a healthier way. So, we called people, I think who we feel kind of represent some of that depth, whether it's like a Scott McKnight or Dallas Willard or, and practitioners, the Cherith Fee Nordling, who's Gordon Fee's daughter. Okay. So this first, the Missional Alliance is something that really our first inaugural national conference is going to be coming this April 11th through the 13th in Old Town Alexandria. I think the beautiful thing is that we have a great mixture of theologians and practitioners. The really being able to benefit from the wide variety of people, men and women. I think there's invited, like, as far as speaking, and that's kind of been the part that I've been more in charge of as this relates is together with JR Roscoe, I think we've invited like 70 or 57% is like non-white male. And so the perspective and the beauty of that, like I don't know of too many movements recently within Missional Church that really start with that.
I don't either.
Purposefulness of that diversity.
Yeah. That's very exciting. Very cool to hear about. Well, so I know you have a website and a blog. Where can people go to find your writing?
Yeah. JRWoodward.net is that's kind of my blog, and it has most everything there. I have a one at .com too that is for probably some different purposes, but I think .net you can find about everything you need.
Okay, cool. And I've got you on my Google Reader, so I've been reading your blog for a while. I know that you've also got some resources on your website.
Yeah. So, in relationship with this book, we have a friend of mine just developed an equiper assessment. So I think it's a good tool to it's free, so people can kind of assess those. Where do I land on these 5 typologies? Mm-hmm. I give each of them a nickname because we're kind of afraid of apostles and prophets. Right.
There's some baggage with that we've attached to it.
So symbols and new nicknames might help people. There's coming before the end of the year a cultural assessment that'll be based on these 5 environments and questions you can ask and kind of look at where you're at and maybe where you need to strengthen yourself. But you can kind of poke around. There's like books that I kind of recommend. Right now I have general books, but I'm going to in time have recommended reading for people who are more apostolic or more prophetic or more evangelistic. But there's tons of free resources, and then I probably blog 6 times a week, so take one day off. That's
really exciting. That's really cool. So the book is Creating a Missional Culture. Where can they go to find the book?
I at a bookstore. You can go to Amazon.
This bookstore you speak of.
Yeah, right. There's the diminishing thing out there. I like to say, if you can find it at the local bookstore, get it there.
Sure.
I like concrete bookstores.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's obviously available on Amazon University, but you should be able to get it anywhere. But unfortunately, a lot of sometimes you have to purposefully ask for it at some bookstores. Some certainly carry it. But it's available anywhere. You can get it on Kindle.
Anywhere your books are sold.
Anywhere books are sold, you can ask for it and they have access to it if it's not right there.
I saw a screenshot. I don't know if you took it or what, but that your book was in between Eugene Peterson and Joel Osteen. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. Last week, I occasionally go and look and see how it's doing. So, and I thought it was a nice encouragement. Maybe you can help me get above Joel Osteen and eventually.
Yes.
Eventually, I did pass him for. At least
So
that
okay,
time
so
period.
you heard it for the first time here. This is officially the campaign to take on Joel Osteen on the Amazon bestseller list. So go out and no, but really, buy this book. Really some illuminating things, I think, and some things that maybe if you're well read in the missional movement, that this might be new. So creating a missional culture by JR Woodward. JR, thanks so much for being with me today.
Hey, thanks for having me, man.
It's been
Appreciate it.
fun. Take care.
Yeah.
Well, there it is. Thanks to JR for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. Had a great time. Remember, subscribe on iTunes if you haven't already. Stop by the blog seminarydropout.com for all the show notes from this show. And I will see you next time. Bye.